The military dog lunged the moment the surgeon reached for the crash cart. 82 pounds of Belgian Malinois hit the equipment tray first, sent steel instruments clattering across the trauma bay floor, and then planted itself directly over the bleeding man's chest, teeth bared, a sound coming from its throat that wasn't quite a growl. It was something rawer than that. Something that made every person in that room take one instinctive step backward. "Get it out!" Dr. Alec Forsyth screamed from the far wall, his gloved hands raised. "Somebody get that animal out of my trauma bay." The man on the table, Navy SEAL Commander Darian Cross, 37 years old, GSW to the left flank and blunt thoracic trauma from a vehicle rollover, had approximately 4 minutes of usable blood pressure left, maybe less. The monitors said so. The monitors were screaming, and the dog wasn't moving. Security Chief Bernard Hollis hit the trauma bay doors at a dead sprint with 2 officers behind him. The dog turned its head, fixed Hollis with pale yellow eyes, and the sound it made climbed several registers. Not a bark, not a warning, something else entirely. In the back corner of the room, partially hidden behind a crash cart she'd been restocking before any of this started, Nurse Mara Voss stood very still and watched the dog instead of the door. She noticed something nobody else in that room was looking for. If you've made it this far, hit that subscribe button right now and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Like this video, tell me where you're watching from, and let's see how far we can take Mara's story together. Now let's get back to it. Harlow Regional Medical Center sat at the northwest edge of Calvert City, Virginia, which was the kind of mid-sized military-adjacent town that existed in a permanent state of almost big enough for a real trauma center, almost close enough to the naval base that it caught the overflow when Fort Lindell's own medical unit got overwhelmed. Almost respected enough that the staff stopped having to justify their equipment budget every fiscal quarter. Almost. Mara Voss had worked trauma triage at Harlow for 6 years, and she'd spent the last 4 months of that run at 27 weeks pregnant, which meant she'd also spent the last 4 months quietly enduring a specific kind of professional erosion that nobody ever acknowledged out loud. Dr. Forsyth had started seeing the charge nurse on emails that used to go directly to her. The scheduling coordinator had twice accidentally assigned her to lower acuity zones without asking. Her direct supervisor, a brittle woman named Claudette Reyes, who had been charge nurse for 11 years and intended to remain so indefinitely, had sat her down 3 weeks ago with a particular brand of studied concern. "We just want to make sure you're not overextending," Claudette had said, hands folded on her desk, voice arranged into the shape of kindness. "You're carrying a baby, Mara. There's no shame in taking it easier." "I'm 27 weeks along, not in a coma," Mara had replied. "Of course. I just think some of the high acuity assignments. I've been doing trauma triage for 6 years, Claudette, and we all respect that." The pause that followed was the kind that did all the real talking. But things are different now. She hadn't been pulled from trauma entirely. That would have required documentation, HR involvement, a paper trail that could come back badly. Instead, she'd been managed sideways. Restocking duties. Intake paperwork overflow. The kind of work that looked like inclusion from the outside and felt from the inside like a slow removal. The night of September 14th, she'd been restocking Cart 7 in Trauma Bay 2, when the call came in through the radio multi-vehicle accident on Route 9. Navy personnel involved. ETA 6 minutes. She'd heard it, noted it, and kept working, because that wasn't her call anymore. Claudette had made that clear. She'd still been at the cart when the bay doors burst open, and Darian Cross came through on the gurney, and she'd stayed where she was because there were already 6 people moving toward him, and her job right now was apparently crash cart inventory. The dog had come through the doors at a dead run 30 seconds later, leash dragging, trailing a young Army corporal who looked like he'd been dragged the entire length of the parking lot and had the road rash to prove it. "Ma'am, I'm sorry," he pulled free. "I couldn't." The dog had cleared the distance from the door to the gurney in under 2 seconds, placed itself across Darian Cross's chest, and the room had shifted into exactly the kind of chaos that a room full of people trained to handle chaos still wasn't designed to handle. Because the variable wasn't medical. The variable had teeth and weighed 82 pounds and was making a sound that didn't belong in a hospital. Mara had stopped restocking. She watched Hollis and his 2 officers trying to approach from different angles. She watched the dog track, all 3 of them simultaneously, weight low, that continuous vocalization still coming from its chest. She watched Dr. Forsyth pressed against the far wall, calling for backup, calling for animal control, calling for someone to do something. And she watched the dog, not the behavior, the dog itself. The way its head was canted slightly to the right, not tracking threats. The way the vocalization had a quality she could only describe as vertical, it kept climbing, and then catching itself, like something was interrupting it from the outside. The way the dog's right rear leg was trembling independently of the rest of its body, which was otherwise controlled, positioned, deliberate. She'd seen that tremor before. Not in a hospital. Somewhere else, in a different part of her life that she'd kept quietly separate from her nursing career because it had never seemed relevant until approximately right now. The intercom above the crash cart chimed the standard 3-tone notification sequence for a secondary incoming trauma. Standard hospital sound. Something she'd heard 10,000 times without registering it. The dog's head snapped up. Every muscle in its body went rigid simultaneously. The vocalization became something else entirely. A high broken sound that lasted exactly as long as the intercom tone did, and then cut off the moment the tone stopped. Mara felt the pieces connect somewhere behind her sternum. Not slowly, all at once, she put down the IV supplies in her hand. "Hold on," she said. Nobody heard her. Too much noise in the room, Hollis shouting, the corporal still apologizing, the monitors alarming with Darian Cross's deteriorating vitals, and the fact that nobody had been able to get near him in 3 minutes. She moved forward. Claudette appeared in the doorway behind her, like she'd materialized from the institutional walls. "Voss." "What are you doing?" "My job," Mara said without turning around. "You are not assigned to this. Then reassign me." She was 6 feet from the dog now. Its attention shifted to her immediately, that pale yellow gaze locking on, the weight dropping lower in its hind quarters, a coiling that looked like aggression preparation, and she was becoming more certain by the second, something else. She stopped moving. She didn't make herself small. That was the wrong instinct with a working military animal. They were trained to read submission as a variable, not a signal. She stood steady and let the dog read her, which took about 4 seconds, and then she did something she hadn't done in 5 years. She used her outside voice, not loud, calibrated. "Ease." The dog's ears rotated, not forward. Sideways, which meant processing. "Ease," she said again, same register. The trembling in the rear leg stopped, just for a moment, then started again as one of Hollis's officers shifted his weight, and the equipment tray beside him gave a small metallic scrape. The dog's head whipped toward the sound, and the broken vocalization surged back. "Everyone stopped moving," Mara said. And because she used the same voice flat, calibrated, carrying the kind of authority that doesn't bother raising itself, everyone actually stopped. Even Hollis. Even Forsyth. Nobody move and nobody touch anything metal. Right now, the room held still. The dog's vocalization descended, climbed, descended. It was watching her again. She was watching it. "Ease," she said for the 3rd time. "Nobody here is going to hurt him." Forsyth's voice came from the far wall, control stripped down to its bones. "Nurse Voss, my patient is going into hemorrhagic shock." "I know," she said. "Give me 90 seconds. She could feel the disbelief in the room like a weather system. Claudette in the doorway, Hollis with his hand on his radio, the corporal still bleeding from his palm where the leash had torn through. None of them said anything, maybe because they'd run out of better options. She took another step toward the dog. "Ease." She let her hands drop to her sides open. "Ease. Nobody's taking him. Nobody's ending anything." The dog, his name was stenciled on his vest. Havoc. Black letters on khaki, looked at her hands. She crouched. Not fast. The way you fold yourself down when the point is not to change your size but your center of gravity, to remove the vertical threat that upright humans carry automatically. Havoc watched her the entire way down. "Easy, buddy," she said quietly. This part wasn't the trained language. This was just her. "I see you. I see what's happening. Just ease." Havoc's muzzle moved. That broken climbing sound again, but shorter. Interrupted. And then the intercom chimed again, the same 3-tone sequence. A second incoming trauma notification, and Havoc's entire body clenched like a fist. The sound that came out of him was nothing she'd prepared for. It wasn't aggression. It was anguish, immediate and physical, and he pulled back from Darian Cross's body, backed into the IV stand behind him and knocked it over, and turned in a tight, disoriented circle that had nothing controlled about it. Mara was on her feet before she'd made the decision to stand up. "Kill the intercom," she said. "Right now. Mute the intercom system in this bay." "I don't have the authority to," Hollis started. "Then find someone who does, Bernard, because that sound is hurting him. That is what this is. That sound is causing him pain." Nobody moved for 1 suspended second. Then Claudette, of all people, crossed to the wall panel and hit the bay-specific audio mute. The intercom went silent. Havoc stopped turning. He stood in the middle of the trauma bay, chest heaving, and looked at Mara with an expression that had nothing animal about it. She took the final step toward him and put one hand flat against the side of his head, just below the ear. Pressure and warmth, and nothing more than that. He leaned into it. Okay, she said, I've got you. Dr. Forsyth was already moving. The team behind him followed, controlled, efficient, everything that should have happened 4 minutes ago happening now. Darian Cross's gurney was surrounded in seconds. The monitors, which had been screaming, began their slow reorganization towards something less catastrophic. Mara stayed where she was, one hand against Havoc's head, the other now resting on the side of his neck, feeling the pulse there rapid, uneven, and wrong in a way that she filed quietly away without saying anything yet. The corporal appeared at her shoulder. His name tape said Rains. He looked like he was 22 years old and had been having a very long night. How did you do that? He's not dangerous, she said. He's in pain, the way he went at Hollis's guys. Was a defense response, not an attack. There's a difference. She kept her voice low, eyes still on Havoc. Who's his primary handler? Commander Cross, ma'am. They don't separate them, not for transport, not for anything. He went in that vehicle. Havoc went in that vehicle. She looked at the gurney where Forsyth's team was working, at Darian Cross with his eyes shut and his color wrong, and at Havoc, who was also watching that gurney now, weight slightly forward, monitoring. Has he had any new equipment recently? Communication gear, a collar system, anything with a signal component. Rains blinked. The unit upgraded to the Stratos VX series last month. For the K9 teams, he pointed at the collar, not a standard leather or nylon working collar, but something heavier, matte black, with a small rectangular module clipped to the side. It's a proximity communication device. Lets the handler signal the K9 from a distance with specific tones. Mara looked at the module, looked at Havoc, looked at the right side of Havoc's head, where he'd been tilting slightly since the moment she'd started paying attention. She didn't say anything else right away. She filed it. By midnight, Darian Cross was out of surgery and in the ICU. Forsyth had managed to repair the splenic laceration before the blood pressure became irretrievable, which made it a very close thing, which was the kind of outcome that created a specific atmosphere in a trauma bay afterward, not relief exactly, more like the collective exhale of people who'd been holding their breath for 2 hours. Mara was in the break room when Claudette found her. She'd been expecting it. She'd already poured herself a cup of coffee she didn't particularly want and sat down with it, which was what she did when she needed to look occupied, without actually being occupied. Claudette sat across from her without being invited. Her expression was the one she wore when she was deciding which angle to approach from, which meant she'd been thinking about this since the moment the bay cleared. That was outside your assignment, Claudette said. The assignment you gave me was crash cart restocking. The crash cart was in Trauma Bay 2. I was in Trauma Bay 2. Mara took a sip of coffee. You engaged with the animal. I de-escalated the situation so Dr. Forsyth could treat his patient, who is currently alive, incidentally. You put yourself at risk, and the baby. There it was. Mara had known it was coming, and it still landed with the specific weight of something being used as a weapon dressed up as a concern. I was never at risk, she said. The dog was not attacking. I knew that within 30 seconds of watching him. You knew that, yes. Claudette's voice went careful. Mara, I'm going to need you to understand that the hospital's position. I'm not interested in the hospital's position right now, Mara said. I'm going to tell you what I'm interested in. She set the coffee down. That dog has something wrong with his ear, specifically his right ear. And he's got a piece of new communication equipment on his collar that I think is causing an acoustic problem, something with the frequency that's triggered by specific tones. The hospital intercom is apparently one of them. His comm signal possibly another. She looked at Claudette steadily. I need someone to contact his unit tonight. Claudette stared at her. You're what, diagnosing the dog? I'm flagging an observation. What the unit and their veterinary team do with it is their business. She picked the coffee back up. But someone needs to make that call. Because if I'm right, there are probably other dogs on the same equipment having the same problem. And if nobody makes that call tonight, the answer that everyone is going to land on is that Havoc is dangerous and should be put down. The word put down sat between them on the table. Claudette opened her mouth, closed it. I'll make the call, she said finally. Thank you. Claudette stood up and then stopped with her hand on the chair back. Something moved across her face that wasn't quite anything Mara could name. Where did you learn to do that? With the dog. Mara looked into her coffee. I spent 2 years at a military rehabilitation facility before nursing school. Animal-assisted therapy programs, including K9 integration for returning veterans. You work with enough of those dogs, you learn to read them. You never mentioned that. Nobody asked. It landed the way it was meant to. Claudette left without anything else. Mara sat alone in the break room and thought about what she'd seen in Havoc's eyes, not the aggression, not even the pain, but the specific expression underneath both of those things, the one that was just exhaustion and trust and wanting someone to understand. She understood. She'd been trying to get people to see past what she looked like, a pregnant woman, diminished by circumstance, reduced to cart restocking and paperwork, long enough to know exactly how it felt. At 2 in the morning, the man who walked through the main entrance of Harlow Regional wasn't wearing a uniform but carried himself like someone who'd worn one so long it had grown into his posture. He was broad across the shoulders, somewhere in his 50s, silver-haired, and he showed a military ID to the front desk with the specific economy of movement that meant he hadn't come here to wait around. His name was Commander Ellis Warwick. He commanded the unit that Darian Cross belonged to. He was not, from the first moment Mara saw him, the kind of person who was going to be easy. He found her in the hallway outside the ICU, because Claudette had apparently told him she was the nurse who'd intervened, which was either a vote of confidence or a deflection, and Mara hadn't decided which yet. "Nurse Voss," he said, not a greeting, a confirmation of a fact. "Commander Warwick, I understand you handled the animal." "I de-escalated him, yes. I was briefed that he attacked security personnel and prevented treatment of my officer. He reacted to a stimulus," she said. "He didn't attack." There's a clinical difference. Warwick studied her in the way that men with his particular kind of authority studied people when they were deciding whether those people were going to be useful or difficult. "You were the assigned nurse?" She met his eyes. "I was in the room." A pause that had some weight to it. "His injury rate this year," Warwick started. "I'm not interested in his statistical record," she said. "I'm interested in his right ear, and I'm interested in the Stratos VX collar module, and I'd like someone with veterinary credential to look at both of those things before anyone makes any decisions about Havoc's future." Warwick's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did, something recalibrated. "What do you think you found?" he said. Not dismissively, carefully. "I think that specific frequency ranges are causing Havoc acute physical pain. I think the hospital intercom happens to fall in one of those ranges, and I think the VX module might be transmitting a frequency that's doing the same thing, which means every time his handler tried to signal him, he was being hurt." She kept her voice even. "I don't know the mechanism. I'm not a veterinarian, but I know what I saw, and what I saw was not an aggressive animal. What I saw was a working dog trying to protect his partner while something was causing him significant pain." The hallway was quiet around them. Somewhere down the corridor, a monitor beeped in its patient rhythm. Warwick looked at her for a long moment, at her face, then briefly, unavoidably, at the visible curve of her pregnancy. Not a leer, something more complicated than that. More like an involuntary recalibration of what he was looking at. She was used to that look. She waited for the recalibration to finish. "I'll get the unit's veterinary specialist here by 0700, he said. "Good. If your assessment is wrong, if my assessment is wrong, I'll say so." She turned to go back to the nurse's station. "If it's right, I'd appreciate it if you'd tell your people the same." She didn't wait to see his reaction to that. The second time Mara saw Havoc that night was at 4:15 in the morning. Animal control had been called, then uncalled, then called again by someone in hospital administration who'd gotten a confused account of events, and the result was that Havoc was currently in a ground floor storage room that had been hastily cleared of medical supplies, not appropriate, not comfortable, but better than the alternatives that had been proposed in the previous few hours, which had included tranquilize and transport to county shelter. Mara had blocked that particular suggestion with 3 separate people before it stopped circulating. She'd also gotten Rains, who'd refused to leave to stay with the dog, which at least meant Havoc wasn't alone. She brought supplies, gauze and antiseptic for the road rash on Rains's palm that nobody had treated yet, water for both of them, a blanket she'd gotten from linen services that she wasn't strictly supposed to have requisitioned for this purpose. Rains looked up when she came in. He was sitting on the floor, with his back against the wall, and Havoc was beside him, not pressed against him, but within contact range, which meant the dog had chosen the proximity rather than been placed in it. "How is he?" she asked. "Quiet, mostly." Rains took the water and looked at the gauze with mild surprise, like he'd forgotten his hand was hurt. "He keeps doing that thing with his head." She could see it. The slight rightward tilt, the ear rotation, right ear pivoting back, not in a threat response, but in the way an animal moves when something is creating uncomfortable sound that it can't locate, like tinnitus, like a frequency that didn't resolve. She sat down on the floor. Havoc looked at her. "Hey," she said quietly. He moved forward 2 steps slowly and put his nose against her rib. Not forceful, investigative. She let him and didn't reach toward him, and eventually he settled beside her with his head resting against her knee, which was not something she had anticipated, and which she thought was going to make it very difficult for her to be clinically detached about any of this. "You worked with these dogs before?" Rains asked. "For a couple of years. A long time ago." She put one hand on Havoc's side, feeling his breathing slow by degrees. "How long has he been tilting his head like that? Maybe 3 weeks? Maybe a little more." Rains in the gauze across his palm absently. "Commander Cross mentioned it. Said they were going to have the vet check him out. But then the deployment extension came through, and it got pushed back." "And when did the unit switch to the VXCOM system?" Rains thought. "About a month ago. 6 weeks, maybe." She looked down at Havoc, who had his eyes half closed now. There was a tightness around his right eye that she hadn't noticed before, subtle. The kind of thing you'd only catch if you were looking at the right angle, which most people in a crisis weren't. She was thinking about the specific chain of events that led to tonight. Havoc responding to the hospital intercom. Havoc responding to the cart scraping on the floor. No, not the cart. The tray. The metal tray, which had produced a particular frequency when it tipped over. The way the vocalization had synced almost perfectly to the duration of the tone and then cut off. She was thinking about the VX module and its proximity signaling, which meant it transmitted, which meant it generated a frequency, calibrated specifically for a dog's hearing range, which was broader than a human's, which was the entire point of the technology, which meant that if the module was transmitting at the wrong frequency, damaged, miscalibrated, or simply engineered badly, it wouldn't just fail to communicate. It would cause harm in the exact register that caused the most harm to an animal with a working dog's auditory sensitivity. And it would do it every single time Darian Cross tried to send a signal. Every single time his handler reached for him, it would feel like being cut. She thought about Darian Cross on the gurney. She thought about what that meant, that the man on the table and the dog standing over him, blocking access. The dog that everyone had seen as a threat, that dog had been trying to protect the one person whose proximity also meant pain, had been trying to hold something together, even as the very mechanism of their connection was destroying him from the inside. She stayed on the floor with Havoc until his breathing evened out completely and he slept, and then she stayed a little longer, because the alternative was going back to the break room and waiting for morning, and she didn't think she could do that. Rains had fallen asleep against the wall sometime around 5. She didn't wake him. At 6:45, the veterinary specialist Warwick had promised arrived Dr. Petra Holst, who carried an equipment case and had the manner of someone who'd been called out of bed and was fine with it, which meant she was either very professional or very used to emergencies. Mara met her in the hallway outside the storage room. Dr. Holst looked at her, the scrubs, the visible pregnancy, the obvious 40-hour shift energy, with a brief, uncomplicated assessment. "You're the nurse?" "Mara Voss." "You think it's the comm equipment?" "I think it's worth ruling out." Dr. Holst nodded once, efficiently. "Walk me through what you observed." Mara walked her through it. The ear tilt, the response to specific tones, the right eye tension, the way the vocalization tracked the frequency duration. Dr. Holst listened without interrupting, which Mara appreciated more than she would have said. When she finished, Dr. Holst said, "Can you get me into the room?"
"Yes."
"Then let's go look." Mara opened the door. Havoc raised his head when they entered. He looked at Mara first, which was the thing she noticed, and something about the way he looked at her recognition, she thought, though she was trying not to overinterpret, made her throat tighten in a way she kept off her face. Dr. Holst went slow and professional, which were the right speeds. She introduced herself to the dog the right way, low body, open hands, no forward pressure, and Havoc assessed her with the particular attention of a well-trained animal evaluating a new variable. He allowed the examination. Dr. Holst started with the ear. She was very quiet for several minutes, using a small scope, working carefully. Havoc held still with the concentrated patience of an animal that had been through many examinations, though his right ear rotated when the instrument went near it. Dr. Holst said, which was not a clinical assessment, but was the kind of sound that meant things were happening in someone's professional mind. She moved to the collar module next, unclipping it with care, turning it over in her hands, examining the contacts. She pulled a small device from her equipment case that Mara didn't recognize and held it near the module for a moment. Her expression changed. "This module is transmitting," she said quietly. Mara went very still. "Right now." Continuously. It shouldn't be, it's meant to transmit only when activated by the handler's unit. But the contacts are corroded. She turned it over again. If the corrosion has shorted the signal switch, it could be transmitting continuously at whatever frequency it was last set to. And if it's transmitting continuously, then this dog has been hearing a proximity signal tone every moment of every day, for however this corrosion has been developing. Dr. Holst looked up, which, combined with any environmental sound that happens to fall in the same frequency register, like a hospital intercom, Mara said. Like a hospital intercom, Doctor. Holst confirmed, would create compounding acoustic trauma in the right auditory canal. She looked at Havoc. He's been living inside a sound that doesn't stop, and every time his handler tried to reach him, it would amplify. The room was very quiet. Rains had woken up at some point in the last few minutes and was listening from the wall. His face had gone through several things and had arrived somewhere that looked like grief. He wasn't attacking, Rain said. No, Mara said. He wasn't. He was trying to hold himself together, she said, while something was hurting him. And when the noise got bad enough, when he was in a room full of tones he couldn't control, the only thing he could do was try to protect the person he was responsible for. She looked at Havoc, who was looking back at her with those pale yellow eyes. In the corridor outside, she heard the sound of military boots, more than one pair moving with purpose. And she heard, underneath that, the voice of Bernard Hollis, security chief, already beginning to frame a narrative that had nothing to do with corroded contacts or compounding acoustic trauma, and everything to do with a dog that had attacked his personnel and needed to be classified as a threat. She heard Commander Warwick's voice too, not yet in the corridor but close, and she didn't know yet what he was going to say. She looked down at Havoc's right ear, the one that had been tilted, that had been tracking pain instead of threats, and then she looked up at Dr. Holst. Document everything, she said, right now. Before anyone comes through that door. Dr. Holst was already writing. Dr. Holst was already writing. The boots in the corridor got louder, and then the door opened and Bernard Hollis came through it with the particular energy of a man who had decided in advance what he was going to find. He took in the room in one sweep. Dr. Holst crouched with her equipment case open, reins against the wall. Mara, standing between Hollis and the dog, and his expression, did the thing that Mara had been watching it do all night, which was arrange itself into a conclusion before the evidence was in. The animal needs to be secured for transport, he said. Animal control is outside. We've had 3 complaints from overnight staff about the incident in the trauma bay, and administration has... Dr. Holst, Mara said, not looking at Hollis. What's your clinical finding on the caller module? Holst didn't look up from her notes. Continuous unintended transmission due to contact corrosion. Probable source of compounding acoustic trauma to the right auditory canal, consistent with the behavioral presentation observed during the trauma bay incident. Hollis stopped, meaning Mara said, turning to face him now, that the dog didn't malfunction. The equipment did. The silence in the room had a specific texture. Rains wasn't moving. Havoc was watching Hollis with the calm, assessing attention of an animal that had decided this particular person was not a threat, which was a more charitable assessment than Mara was currently making. That doesn't change what happened in my trauma bay, Hollis said, recovering. He injured 2 security personnel. He made contact while in acute pain when 2 people rushed toward him in a high-stimulus environment. Mara kept her voice level. That's a defensive reaction, not an attack. There's a difference with working animals, and it matters legally. Nurse Voss. Hollis said her name the way people said things when they wanted the name itself to do the work of putting someone in their place. You are not the animal control officer. You are not the veterinarian. You are the person who de-escalated the situation so your security team didn't get anyone killed, she said, including your personnel. She let that sit for exactly 1 second. Dr. Holst is the veterinarian. She has findings. I'd suggest you let her finish documenting them before anyone makes a decision that's going to look very bad in about 12 hours. Hollis looked at Holst. Holst looked up from her notes for the first time and met his eyes with the specific professional blankness of someone who had been in rooms like this before and had no interest in the politics of them. I'd recommend against transport until I complete my examination, Holst said simply, for the animal's welfare and for your facility's liability position. That last phrase, liability position, did something to Hollis's posture that nothing else had. He stood in the doorway for another moment, then took 1 step back. I'll need to brief administration, he said. That seems appropriate, Mara said. He left. The door didn't quite close behind him. Mara let out a breath she'd been managing since he walked in, slow and controlled, through her nose. Her lower back had been aching for the last 2 hours in the specific way that her OB had told her to take seriously, which she was filing under later. Everything went under later right now. You do that a lot? Rains asked. She looked at him. Do what? Make people back down without actually, raising your voice. She thought about it. I've had a lot of practice lately, she said. Commander Warwick arrived at 7:20, with a colonel she hadn't met named Adele Marsh, who had the clipped precision of someone accustomed to making large decisions quickly and not revisiting them. They stood in the hallway outside the storage room, while Dr. Holst gave her preliminary findings, which took 11 minutes and which Mara observed from 4 feet away, because nobody had told her to leave yet, and she wasn't going to volunteer. Holst laid it out without editorializing: the corroded contacts, the continuous transmission, the right ear presentation, which showed inflammation and early-stage tissue irritation, consistent with prolonged acoustic trauma. The behavioral pattern stimulus reactive, not predatory, not neurologically unstable, that fit the acoustic injury model cleanly. Colonel Marsh asked 3 questions. All of them were about the equipment, not the dog. When Holst finished, Marsh looked at Warwick. Something passed between them that Mara couldn't fully read, but could feel the weight of something being recalculated. The VX series, Marsh said. How many units are currently deployed with it? In this region alone, 14 K9 teams, Warwick said. He wasn't looking at Marsh. He was looking at the door behind which Havoc was. Across all active deployments, I'd need to pull the numbers. 60 plus. The hallway was quiet enough that Mara could hear a cart being pushed somewhere on the floor above. And complaints? Marsh asked. Warwick's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. There have been some behavioral reports, dogs being flagged as unstable, 3 removals from active service in the last 2 months. He paused. 2 of those dogs were euthanized. Mara felt the words land somewhere in her chest. Before anyone looked at the equipment, she said. Both of them turned to look at her. She hadn't been invited into the conversation technically, but she was done managing her own footprint in a situation where it mattered. Before anyone looked at the equipment, Warwick repeated, not agreeing with her exactly. More like the repetition itself was the acknowledgement. Colonel Marsh studied Mara for a moment. You're the nurse. Mara Voss. Yes. You noticed the ear tilt and the frequency correlation. Yes. Marsh nodded once, the way people nodded when they were processing information rather than responding to it. Then she turned back to Warwick. I want all VX units flagged by end of day. No active transmissions until the equipment is inspected. Yes, ma'am. And I want someone talking to Stratos Defense about when they first identified this as a possible issue. The name Stratos Defense sat in the hallway like something with mass. Mara noted it. She didn't say anything, but she noted it. By 9 in the morning, Mara had been on shift for 15 hours, and her supervisor had reminded her twice that she was scheduled to clock out at 7, which was technically true and also completely irrelevant to everything happening around her. And she'd said as much both times, and Claudette had sighed the specific sigh of a woman who had run out of arguments she was willing to make out loud. The hospital was doing the thing hospitals did when something unusual had happened the night before, and the day shift was arriving with no context, a low-level buzz of partial information moving from station to station, filling in its own gaps with whatever was convenient. She heard 3 different versions of what had happened in Trauma Bay 2, and none of them included the phrase acoustic trauma, and all of them included the word vicious. She was at the nurse's station updating her notes when she heard the version that made her stop typing. It was coming from 2 nurses she vaguely knew day shift, the kind of people who arrived with opinions already formed about whatever the overnight drama had been. One of them was talking too loudly in the way that meant she wanted to be overheard. Apparently completely lost control of the animal, injured 2 people, and they had to bring in military to contain it. The nurse who tried to get near it, the pregnant one, could have been killed. That's not what happened, Mara said. Both of them turned. She recognized the look they gave her, which was a specific combination of surprise that she'd spoken and reassessment of who they were talking to. I was there, she said. The dog was in acute physical distress caused by a malfunctioning piece of equipment. He was not attacking. The security team escalated a situation that required de-escalation. The dog protected his handler and allowed medical staff to treat him once the source of pain was removed. She looked at them evenly. That's what happened. Neither of them said anything. She went back to her notes. She was aware, without looking up, of the particular silence that followed the kind that meant people were having reactions they weren't going to voice. She was used to that silence too. She'd been accumulating it for months. Her back was still aching. She shifted in her chair and kept typing. 10 minutes later, Rains appeared at the station with 2 cups of coffee, one of which he put on the desk in front of her without comment. She looked at it, then at him. "You don't have to be here," she said. "No place to be," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "My unit's on standby pending equipment inspection." So he wrapped both hands around his cup. "I'm here." She took the coffee. It was terrible, which meant it was from the machine on the second floor, which was the one she always used, because the one on the third floor produced something that tasted like aspirations. "Did you know about the behavioral reports? The dogs that were removed?" He took a long moment. "I heard about one." Burke, another handler in the unit, his dog Sable, started showing aggression incidents about 6 weeks ago. Sable got pulled from service, then he stopped. "Then she was euthanized," Mara said. He nodded slowly. Burke was told she'd become neurologically unstable, that the aggression was unpredictable, and the risk assessment didn't support keeping her in service. He looked at his coffee. He believed them. He had no reason not to believe them. Mara thought about the corridor conversation between Warwick and Marsh. 2 dogs, 60-plus units on the same equipment. A company named Stratos Defense. "Burke should know," she said. "Yeah." Rains said it like someone who'd already been sitting with that thought and didn't like the weight of it. He should. At 10:45, Bernard Hollis made his move. She should have seen it coming earlier. In retrospect, the shape of it was obvious. Hollis had been embarrassed in the storage room. His authority deflected twice in front of his own staff and in front of military personnel, and he was the kind of man who responded to that by finding a different angle to push from. The angle he found was hospital administration. Mara was in the corridor outside the ICU when Claudette caught up with her with an expression that was part apology and part preparation for the delivery of unwelcome news. "We need to talk," Claudette said. They went to the small conference room off the nurses' station, which was where conversations happened that needed to be documented or denied, depending on how they went. Claudette sat. Mara sat across from her. She noticed that Claudette had brought a folder, which was the kind of thing that meant this had already moved past conversation into the register of formal process. "Bernard filed an incident report," Claudette said. "I assumed he would. He's listed you as having acted outside your assignment scope, in a way that created liability risk for the hospital." Claudette opened the folder but didn't look at it. "He's also, and I want to be straightforward with you, about this raised questions about whether your current physical condition impaired your judgment." Mara felt the specific cold clarity that came with hearing something said out loud that had previously only been implied. Not anger, exactly. More like watching a thing that had been lurking in peripheral vision finally step into the open. "He's suggesting my pregnancy impaired my judgment," she said. "He's suggesting that taking a physical position on the floor in proximity to an unsecured military animal while 27 weeks pregnant represents a decision-making concern. I was in controlled contact with an animal I had assessed as safe. I did not put myself at risk." The documentation from Dr. Holst supports my assessment. She kept her voice flat. "If the dog had been what Hollis thought he was, my condition would have been relevant. But the dog was not what Hollis thought he was. That's the entire point. Mara, he wants me assigned away from the Cross case." Claudette's expression confirmed it before she spoke. "He's requested that any further nursing involvement in Commander Cross's care come from a different staff member." He cited the incident as a boundary issue. She paused. "Administration is inclined to agree. They want to minimize liability, and this situation has visibility. The military's involvement, the animal incident people, are paying attention." Mara looked at the folder, at the table, at the window that showed a narrow rectangle of gray morning sky. She thought about Darian Cross, who was in the ICU 2 floors up, who had not yet been told about his dog, and who had apparently tried to report a problem with the VX equipment before the accident. She thought about what that meant, that the man who was carrying information about the danger had been removed from the field in an accident she didn't yet have complete information about. She thought about Stratos Defense. She thought about Burke, whose dog Sable was dead. "Okay," she said. Claudette blinked. "Okay. Reassign me from Commander Cross's direct care." She stood up. "But I'd like it documented that I'm not stepping back because I agree with the incident report. I'm stepping back because arguing about it right now is a poor use of my time in the hospitals." She picked up her water bottle. "Dr. Holst's documentation and the military's equipment findings are going to reframe everything Hollis put in that report within 24 hours. I'd like my response on record before that happens." Claudette looked at her for a moment. Something moved across her face again, that nameless thing. "I'll note your objection. Thank you. She left the conference room and walked back to the nurse's station, where she sat down, took a breath, and pulled up a new document on the terminal. Her own incident record, time-stamped, noting every observation she'd made, from the moment she heard the radio call to the moment Dr. Holst began her examination. Every frequency correlation she'd observed, the exact sequence of the intercom tone and Havoc's response, the ear tilt, the right eye tension, the continuous transmission finding. She wrote it the way she'd learned to write things that might matter later, not defensively, not with emotion, just the facts arranged in the order that made their meaning undeniable. She was nearly finished when Rains appeared again, and this time his face was different. The easy tiredness of the overnight hours had been replaced by something sharper. "They're talking about moving up the timeline," he said, low. She looked up. "What timeline?" "For Havoc." He glanced down the corridor. Hollis talked to someone in administration, who apparently talked to someone in hospital legal, who raised questions about ongoing liability for the facility if the animal remains on premises. "There's a meeting at noon." His voice had thinned. "Warwick's going to be in it, but Marsh had to leave for base. And without Marsh, Hollis has more weight in the room," she said. "The vet's not a hospital employee. Her findings are preliminary. And the 2 security guys Havoc made contact with, they're pushing their injury claims this morning." She saved the document, printed 2 copies, one for herself, one to go in her formal file. She stacked them on the desk and looked at Rains. "Is Dr. Holst still here?" "She's finishing her examination. I need her final report complete and signed before that noon meeting. Can you get to her? I can try." "Try fast." She was already standing. "And I need the make and model of the VX module, plus whatever documentation the unit has on when those modules were distributed. Batch numbers, deployment dates, anything. Why? Because if Stratos Defense had internal knowledge of this defect and shipped the equipment anyway, the liability picture changes entirely. And whoever is in that noon meeting needs to understand where the liability actually sits before they make a decision based on where Hollis wants them to think it sits." Rains stared at her for a moment. Then he pulled out his phone and started moving down the corridor. She turned back to the nurse's station, picked up her printed copies, and walked in the opposite direction with the precise, unhurried speed of someone who had completely run out of time to be managed sideways. She found Warwick in the small family waiting area outside the ICU at 11:15, which was where she'd guessed he would be, because it was the only place in this wing, with a clear sight line to cross his room, and he was the kind of commanding officer who maintained proximity to his people. He looked up when she sat across from him. He didn't look surprised. "There's a noon meeting," she said. "I'm aware. Hollis is going to push for Havoc's removal from the premises on liability grounds. He's going to frame last night as an ongoing threat to the facility. I know what he's going to say. Do you know what you're going to say back?" Warwick looked at her with the expression she was coming to recognize as his specific version of assessment, not dismissive, not entirely open, somewhere in the narrow band between. "Dr. Holst's findings are preliminary," he said. "They'll be final and signed by 11:50 if she's given the time to complete them." He was quiet for a moment. "I want to be direct with you, Nurse Voss," he said. "Please. When I walked into this hospital at 2 in the morning, I was prepared to authorize removal. The behavioral record this year, 3 incidents, 2 of them with injury." He stopped. "I had a report in front of me that said Havoc had become unpredictable, that the instability was progressive." "Who gave you that report?" He looked at his hands. "It came through standard channels. Unit assessment reviewed by." He paused. "Stratos Defense has an embedded assessment officer, part of the contract for the VX rollout. They provided supplementary behavioral evaluations for K9 teams on the new system. Mara sat with that for exactly 3 seconds. Stratos Defense assessed the behavior of dogs injured by their own equipment," she said. "I'm becoming aware that may be a structural problem, yes." "Commander." She leaned forward slightly. "Someone from that company looked at dogs that were in pain from their product, wrote reports calling them unstable, and allowed those animals to be removed from service or destroyed, and then delivered equipment inspections that cleared the product." The waiting room was very quiet. Outside the windows, the morning had gone bright and thin. "2 of those dogs are dead," she said. "And the company still has an embedded officer providing assessments for your unit." Warwick's face didn't show much, but something in his posture shifted an almost invisible realignment, like tectonic. "The batch documentation," he said, "from the VX rollout. My corporal is pulling it now." He looked at her. "When did you sleep last?" he said. "Yesterday sometime," she said. "Before my shift," he nodded slowly. "The noon meeting." He stood up. I'll need Holst's report and the batch numbers both before I walk into that room. You'll have them. He moved toward the door and then stopped with his hand on the frame. He didn't turn around. For what it's worth, he said. The report I was given about last night, the one that came through, Hollis said the situation was resolved because animal control arrived, not because a nurse noticed something was wrong. He was quiet for a moment. That's the version in the official incident log right now. She felt that land. She felt where it landed and what it meant and what it was going to take to correct it. I'm aware, she said. He left. She sat alone in the waiting room for a moment, looking at the window. Her back was still aching. The baby moved a slow, rolling shift that she felt somewhere deep, unhurried, indifferent to all of this in the particular way that things inside you were sometimes indifferent to what was happening outside. She put one hand flat against her abdomen, just for a second. Then she stood up, picked up her folder, and went to find Dr. Holst. She was in the elevator when her phone buzzed. It was a message from Rains, batch numbers pulled. VX module's shipping date 6 weeks ago, also found something. Call me. She read it twice. Something. In her experience, something was always the thing that changed everything. She stepped out of the elevator on the ground floor and dialed. Rains picked up on the first ring, and what he said made her stop walking in the middle of the corridor, one hand against the wall, while 2 orderlies moved around her without noticing. The batch documentation, he said. There's an internal routing tag on it. Standard logistics marking. His voice was strange, controlled but thin, like he was keeping it that way deliberately. The tag shows this batch was flagged for quality review before shipping 6 weeks ago. Flagged by who? By Stratos Defense's own engineering division. A pause. And then the flag was cleared 48 hours later by someone in their compliance office. Same batch shipped the next day. She stood in the corridor and said nothing for a moment. They knew, she said. There's a name on the clearance sign-off, Rain said. I've got it. I've got the document number and the signature and the date. Her hand tightened on the phone. Send me everything, she said. Right now. And Rains, yeah. Don't send it from your unit phone. Use something else. A beat. Then understood. The call ended. She lowered the phone and stood in the corridor for another moment, looking at nothing in particular, while somewhere above her in the ICU, Darian Cross was sleeping off surgery and didn't yet know that the thing that almost killed his dog had a name and a signature and a date. And somewhere in a building that had nothing to do with this hospital, the person who had signed that clearance form was having a normal Tuesday morning. For now. The document came through on her personal phone 40 seconds later, a photograph of a printed logistics form, slightly angled, taken in what looked like a supply room. Rains had good instincts. The image was clear enough to read every field. She stood in the corridor and read it twice. The quality flag was dated 6 weeks and 3 days ago. The flag category read, Acoustic Frequency Deviation K9 Auditory Threshold Exceedance, Intermittent Transmission Fault under Corrosive Conditions. Someone in Stratos Defense's own engineering division had run the test, identified the problem, written it up in the language that made the problem undeniable, and submitted it for review. 48 hours later, a compliance officer named R. Calloway had cleared the batch with a single line of notation, within acceptable operational variance. Cleared for deployment. Within acceptable operational variance. She put the phone in her pocket and kept walking, and she didn't let herself stay with the rage that had taken up residence up somewhere behind her sternum. Because rage wasn't useful right now, and she was very aware of how much right now she had left. Dr. Holst was in the ground floor exam room that had been repurposed for Havoc's evaluation, and she was finishing her written report when Mara came through the door. The equipment case was packed. Havoc was resting on the blanket in the corner, the same one Mara had brought from Linen Services 7 hours ago. And he raised his head when she entered and then put it back down, which she took as either trust or exhaustion and suspected it was both. How close are you? Mara asked. Holst didn't look up. 10 minutes. I needed an 8. Holst's pen kept moving. Then stopped talking to me. Fair enough. Mara stood near the door and read the logistics document, again on her phone while Holst wrote, and the baby moved again, less rolling this time, more deliberate, an elbow or a knee tracing a slow arc, and she pressed her palm flat against her side and breathed. She was thinking about the word variance. Acoustic Frequency Deviation K9 Auditory Threshold Exceedance. That was what the engineers had written. They had measured it, named it, quantified it. They knew what it meant, that when the module corroded under field conditions, and field conditions included humidity, sweat, rain, the ordinary abuse of equipment used in active service, the module would begin transmitting continuously at a frequency, specifically calibrated to penetrate canine hearing at range. A frequency chosen because it was effective. A frequency that became in malfunction, something that didn't stop. Within acceptable operational variance, 2 dogs were dead. Holst signed the last page at 7 minutes and 40 seconds. She stacked the pages, clipped them, and handed them across without ceremony. Preliminary findings confirmed and finalized. Right ear acute acoustic trauma, probable duration 4 to 6 weeks. Behavioral presentation inconsistent with neurological instability or predatory aggression. Fully consistent with sustained pain response. She paused. If someone tries to characterize what happened in that trauma bay as an attack, this document will make them look either ignorant or dishonest. Which would you prefer? Holst picked up her case. I'd prefer they read it before the meeting and make better choices. She looked at Havoc. He needs quiet, clean water, and for no one to run a signal tone within 100 yards of him for the next 72 hours minimum. After that, I want to recheck the ear. I'll make sure of it. You don't have authority over this facility's storage rooms. I have authority over some things, Mara said. Holst looked at her for a moment, then gave a short, definite nod that contained something Mara recognized as respect between professionals who didn't have time to be sentimental about it. Then she left. Mara crossed to where Havoc was resting and crouched down carefully, the way she did everything at 27 weeks, a constant negotiation with her own center of gravity, and put her hand flat against his side. His breathing was even. The right ear twitched once, then stilled. I'm going to a meeting, she told him. I'll be back. She straightened up and walked out. The noon meeting was in Conference Room B on the administrative floor, which had a long table and windows that let in pale November light and the kind of institutional neutrality that was designed to make everything that happened in it feel procedural. Mara arrived at 11:58 with Holst's report and the logistics document printed from her phone at the nurse's station, 2 copies of each, and found Warwick already seated on one side of the table with the batch documentation Rains had pulled. Hollis was across from him with a woman from Hospital Legal named Diane Pratt, who had the specific alert stillness of someone who had read a briefing document on the way up the elevator and was still processing it. There were 2 other people Mara didn't know, administrative staff, by the look of them, mid-level, the kind of people who attended meetings to observe and report upward. Nobody said anything when she sat down next to Warwick. Hollis looked at her. This meeting is between hospital administration and Commander Warwick's unit. I'm the nursing staff member with direct observational data on the incident and Dr. Holst's completed clinical findings. She set the report on the table. I was asked by Commander Warwick to be present. She looked at Warwick. Warwick said, "That's correct." Hollis's jaw moved. He chose not to push it further, which was the right tactical choice and probably the only one he had. Pratt called the meeting to order in the way that lawyers called things to order, which was by stating the purpose so specifically that everyone in the room understood exactly which version of events was currently official. We're here to assess the liability position for Harlow Regional with respect to last night's incident, and to determine appropriate next steps regarding the animal currently on the premises. Before we do that, Mara said, I'd like to enter Dr. Holst's clinical findings into the record. She slid the report across to Pratt, who picked it up and read the first page. Her expression didn't change, but the pace of her reading did it slowed, which meant she was reading more carefully, which meant something in the language was making her recalibrate. Hollis hadn't looked at the report. He was watching Mara. The dog's behavior last night has been characterized as an unprovoked attack, Mara said. The clinical findings established that characterization as factually incorrect. Havoc was responding to acute acoustic pain caused by a malfunctioning piece of equipment. His behavior was a sustained defensive response, not an attack. She kept her voice even, the way she kept it even when she needed to be heard rather than dismissed. The 2 security officers who were contacted, that contact occurred when they attempted rapid approach of a working military animal in acute pain. That's a risk that existed because of equipment failure, not because of the animal. Pratt looked up from the report. This is preliminary. It's finalized and signed. Page 4. Mara had flagged the signature page with a paperclip. She watched Pratt find it. The liability question, Hollis said, taking the floor with the confidence of a man who had prepared for this meeting and was still running the version where he was in charge of it, is ongoing. This animal is on hospital premises. If there is any further incident, the source of last night's incident has been identified and isolated, Warwick said. He said it quietly, and quiet from Warwick had a specific weight. The module has been removed. Dr. Holst has confirmed the behavioral trigger is external. not intrinsic. There is no ongoing threat. With respect, Commander, you can't guarantee. I'm not guaranteeing anything. I'm telling you what the veterinary findings say. He slid the batch documentation toward Pratt. I'm also telling you that the equipment that caused this incident was shipped by Stratos Defense Acoustics with a known defect. There is internal documentation confirming their engineering division identified the fault prior to shipping. The room went very still. Pratt picked up the logistics form. She read it. She set it down. Where did this come from? She asked. Unit logistics records, Warwick said. It was true, technically. It had come from unit logistics records. The fact that it had come from Rains photographing a document in a supply room under time pressure was a detail the morning hadn't required Warwick to specify. Pratt looked at the document for another moment. Then she looked at Hollis. Something had changed in her posture, an almost imperceptible withdrawal, the body language of a lawyer who has just seen the terrain of a liability question shift under her feet. This changes the posture significantly, she said. Her voice was careful and precise. If Stratos Defense shipped equipment with a documented defect that directly caused a behavioral incident resulting in injury to hospital personnel, the liability does not sit with Harlow Regional. It sits with Stratos, Mara said. Pratt looked at her. It potentially sits with Stratos, yes. Hollis said, that doesn't change the immediate... Bernard Pratt said his name the way that ended sentences. The immediate question is whether continued presence of the animal on the premises constitutes ongoing liability. Given these findings, the answer is no. The risk was specific and has been mitigated. She closed the folder. I'm going to recommend against the removal order, pending further coordination with the military. She looked at Warwick. I'll need a formal statement from Dr. Holst and the batch documentation in original format. You'll have both by end of day, Warwick said. Hollis sat very still. He was looking at the table. Mara watched him process the distance between where he'd been 30 minutes ago and where he was now, and she felt nothing about it that was generous and nothing that was petty. She just felt the distance. For the record, she said, I'd also like it documented that the incident report characterizing last night's events as resolved by animal control is factually inaccurate. The situation was de-escalated by nursing staff prior to any animal control involvement. I have a time-stamped incident record that corroborates this. She slid her own documentation across the table. Pratt read it, nodded once. I'll note the correction. Hollis didn't look up. The meeting ended 11 minutes after it had started, which was fast for an administrative proceeding and entirely appropriate given what they'd been discussing, and Mara was in the elevator going back down before she'd let herself feel any of it. She felt it in the elevator. Not triumph, she'd been doing this long enough to know that noon meetings weren't endings, they were pivots. But something real, something that had shifted. The baby moved again. She put her hand on her side. I know, she said quietly. Me too. Darian Cross was awake at 2 in the afternoon. She found out because Rains texted her commanders up, asking for Havoc, and she was back from a cafeteria lunch. She'd mostly failed to eat when she saw it. She wasn't his assigned nurse anymore. Claudette had followed through on the reassignment, which meant the nursing staff managing Cross's ICU care were 2 day-shift nurses named Porter and Gale who had no particular context for why their patient was asking about a dog and no particular idea how to answer him. Mara went up anyway. She stood outside the ICU glass for a moment and looked at him. Darian Cross was a big man made smaller by the machinery he was connected to. The chest tube was still in, the drainage bag at the bedside, the monitoring lines across both forearms. He was awake, eyes open, head turned toward the door. And even from here, she could see him doing the thing that people did when they were coming back from surgery into a body that had been through something and were trying to take inventory. Porter was in the room. Porter was 24 years old and had been a nurse for 14 months, which meant she was competent and overwhelmed and was not equipped to manage what was about to happen. Mara pushed the door open. Porter looked up. He's not your patient. I know. She crossed to the bed and let Cross see her face, which was a deliberate choice. She didn't know if he'd been briefed on who she was. But she knew he'd been briefed on something, because Warwick had been in to see him an hour ago. Commander Cross, I'm Mara Voss. I was here last night. He looked at her for a moment. His voice was rough from the intubation. You're the one who stopped him. I'm the one who talked to him. Yes. Where is he? She said it straight. He's in a room on the ground floor. He's resting. Dr. Holst, the veterinary specialist, examined him this morning. He has acoustic trauma in his right ear from the VX module. He's going to need time to recover, but he's not in danger. Cross absorbed this with the particular stillness of someone managing a large amount of information at once on a small amount of available capacity. His eyes were sharp despite everything else. The module, he said. Yes, I told them. He stopped to breathe. The chest tube made deep breathing expensive, and she watched him manage the cost of it. Before the accident, I submitted a behavioral report on Havoc 3 weeks ago. Said something was wrong. They sent back an assessment saying he was showing instability patterns. His jaw tightened. Stratos assessment said the module was fine. I know, she said. Sable. He looked at her. She held his eyes. I know about Sable. He turned his face toward the window. The muscle in the side of his jaw worked once. Burke needs to know the truth, he said. Warwick's people are working on it. She paused. Commander, I need to ask you something. The accident on Route 9, what do you know about what caused it? He turned back to her slowly. What are you asking? I'm asking if the accident was related to the report you filed. He looked at her for a long time. Long enough that Porter shifted uncomfortably near the door. Long enough that Mara began to wonder if she'd pushed into something she didn't have the full picture of yet. I filed the report through standard channels, he said finally. The route back from the base that night, I took it every week. I'd taken it that week already. Another breath, managed carefully. Havoc was agitated from the moment we got in the vehicle, worse than usual. I was trying to manage him, and he stopped. The car that hit us came through the intersection without stopping. I've been replaying it. Did you see the car? It was dark. He closed his eyes briefly. I don't know. She nodded. She didn't push further. She filed it the same way she'd been filing things since 2 in the morning and shifted her weight and said, get some rest. Havoc is safe. That's the thing that matters right now. He opened his eyes. They were very direct, the eyes of someone who'd spent a career assessing situations for what they actually were. You didn't have to do any of this, he said. No, she agreed. I didn't. She left the room. The escalation she hadn't anticipated came at 4:17 in the afternoon, which was the kind of timing that suggested it had been building since the noon meeting ended, and someone had spent the intervening hours making phone calls. She was back at the nurse's station. She was not going home. She had stopped pretending she was going home when Warwick appeared at the end of the corridor, and his expression had changed in a way she registered before she'd consciously identified what was different about it. He sat down across from her without preamble. That alone told her something. Stratos Defense has a legal team, he said, I assumed. They've been in contact with hospital administration in the last hour. They're contesting the logistics document, claiming it was obtained improperly, and that the quality flag was a routine notation that doesn't indicate the company had knowledge of a deployment stage risk. She looked at him. With an acceptable operational variance. Their position is that the variance was acceptable, that the corrosion scenario was not a foreseeable failure mode under normal use conditions. His voice was flat in the way that meant he was managing something. They also have a statement from their embedded assessment officer, the one who evaluated the behavioral reports on Havoc and Sable and the others, that the behavioral findings were independent of equipment performance and that the dogs showed genuine instability markers. That's a lie. I know that. Dr. Holst's finding are one veterinarian's preliminary turned final report on one animal. Stratos is going to dispute the causal chain. They're going to say the ear inflammation could have other causes, that the behavioral incidents predate the equipment by the behavioral incidents don't predate the equipment. The batch shipped 6 weeks ago, the first incident reports, started appearing within 2 weeks of deployment. I have that in the documentation. Mara. He said her name quietly, and it stopped her. I know all of this. But they have resources, and they have legal counsel, and they have an embedded officer who has been producing documentation for 3 months that creates an alternative record. He leaned forward slightly. What we have is Holst's report, the logistics form, and your observational record. What we need is the original quality review, not a photograph of the form, the original with the chain of custody intact. She understood immediately. Raines's photograph won't hold up in a formal proceeding. It'll be challenged. It may not survive the challenge. She sat back. Her back ached. The fluorescent light above the nurse's station was doing something with its frequency that she'd been aware of all day. And that was now, in the particular exhaustion of hour 18, starting to feel personal. The original document, she said. Where would it be? Stratos Defense's internal quality management system, which is proprietary, password protected, and housed on their servers. Warwick looked at her steadily, which we cannot access. Who can? A federal subpoena, which requires an active investigation, which requires a formal complaint to a federal oversight body, which is the JAG Office for Military Equipment, or the Department of Defense Inspector General. How long does that take? To initiate, 24 to 48 hours for an expedited request given the military angle. He paused. But here's the problem. Stratos knows the documentation exists. If they know we're pursuing it formally, they have time to manage their records, she said. It happens, not always, but it happens. She thought about R. Calloway and the signature on the clearance form and the 48 hours between the flag and the cleared notation. She thought about the kind of person who looked at acoustic frequency deviation, K9 auditory threshold exceedance, and wrote within acceptable operational variance and meant it to hold. She thought about Burke. There's another angle, she said. Warwick waited. The embedded assessment officer, she said. The one who evaluated the behavioral reports. What's their name? Warwick looked at her for a moment. Why? Because they're not a Stratos employee, are they? They're an embedded contractor, which means they work within the unit. They have access to both sets of documentations and the equipment assessments, and they may have observed things they weren't supposed to observe. She looked at him, or produced reports they weren't comfortable producing. Something moved in Warwick's expression. What makes you think they weren't comfortable? Because someone gave Rains access to a supply room with that logistics document in it, she said. And someone made sure those batch records were easy to pull this morning when I asked for them. She held his eyes. Did Rains find those documents on his own, or did someone make sure he could find them? The silence between them lasted about 4 seconds. The assessment officer's name is Lieutenant Veroncosi, Warwick said. She's been embedded with the unit for 10 weeks. She submitted the behavioral assessments on Havoc and 2 other dogs. He paused. She also submitted an addendum to the Havoc assessment 2 weeks ago that was flagged by Stratos' liaison as inappropriate and pulled from the official record. What did the addendum say? I don't know. I didn't see it before it was pulled. Mara thought about a woman named Vera Nkosi writing an addendum and having it pulled, and what that meant about what she'd been watching from the inside of that company's contract. I need to talk to her, she said. She's on base. Can you get me on base? Warwick looked at her. At the visible exhaustion she was no longer bothering to hide. At the folder of documentation on the desk between them. At unavoidably the pregnancy. The way it preceded everything. The way it was the thing everyone's eyes went to when they were deciding how seriously to take the rest of her. You've been awake for almost 20 hours, he said. So have you, he almost smiled. It didn't quite make it to his face, but it came close. I'll make a call, he said. Give me 40 minutes. He stood up and moved down the corridor, and Mara turned back to her terminal and pulled up everything she'd documented across the 18 hours of this shift, every timestamp and observation and piece of analysis, and she began building it into a single coherent record, the kind that could survive scrutiny, the kind that told us which was also just the truth, arranged in the order that made it impossible to look away from. She had been at it for 20 minutes when her phone buzzed. She picked it up expecting Warwick or Rains or some administrative development. The number was unfamiliar, area code she didn't recognize. She answered. A woman's voice, low and controlled, the voice of someone who was speaking quietly in a room where they needed to be quiet. Is this Mara Voss? Yes, my name's Veroncosi. I'm told you're looking for the original quality review. Mara stopped typing. I have it, Nkosi said, the original. Signed, with the lab report attached, and the full frequency deviation data. A pause. I've had it for 5 weeks. I've been trying to figure out what to do with it for 5 weeks. Mara's hand tightened on the phone. Tell me where you are, she said. That's the problem, Nkosi said. 20 minutes ago, Stratos' legal team contacted my supervisor. Someone told them I might have the original documents. Her voice stayed controlled, but something in the texture of it had changed the thin edge of someone who has been careful for a long time and is now running out of road. They want me at a meeting at the base legal office at 6 o'clock tonight. My supervisor is strongly recommending I attend. Mara looked at the clock on the terminal. 4:31, 90 minutes. Lieutenant Nkosi, she said, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I'm listening. Don't go to that meeting without someone from JAG. Your own representation, not a Stratos liaison, not anyone connected to the contract. She was already standing up, reaching for her bag. Can you get to JAG in 90 minutes, if I leave now? Then leave now, and Nkosi, yes, the document. Is it physical or digital? Both. Physical original is locked in my personal storage unit. Digital copy is a pause, very brief. Somewhere they won't find it in 90 minutes. Good. Mara was already moving toward the elevator. Don't tell me where. Don't tell anyone where. Just get to JAG. The dogs, Nkosi said. And her voice did something then cracked. Just slightly at the edge of the word. Just enough. Sable and Kira. I know, Mara said. I know what they were. She hit the elevator call button. Go right now. Don't stop. The call ended. She stood at the elevator and thought about 90 minutes, and a woman walking out of a building with a document that could end this, and a legal team on the other side that had 90 minutes to realize what was happening and close the distance. The elevator doors opened. She stepped in, and as the doors closed behind her, she became aware in the flat, certain way that things became certain when you'd been awake long enough for the noise to die down, that somewhere in the last 18 hours, this had stopped being about a dog and a trauma bay and a malfunctioning collar, and somewhere in the halls of Stratos Defense Acoustics, the person who had signed R. Calloway on a quality clearance form 6 weeks ago had just picked up a phone, and somewhere in the halls of Stratos Defense Acoustics, the person who had signed R. Calloway on a quality clearance form 6 weeks ago had just picked up a phone. Mara didn't know what that call contained. She didn't need to. She knew the shape of it, the specific shape of a person who has done a calculable thing, discovering that the calculation is coming apart, reaching for the phone the way people reached for a railing when the floor shifted. She'd seen it happen in smaller rooms than this one, with smaller stakes, and the motion was always the same, not guilt, not remorse, just the cold arithmetic of exposure. She hit the lobby at a speed that was as close to running as she was willing to get at 27 weeks, which was fast enough that the security desk looked up. She didn't stop. Warwick was in the parking structure, which was where he'd said he'd be, sitting in a government-plated vehicle with his phone in his hand and an expression she hadn't seen on him yet, something that had moved past controlled and into the register of a man who was reassessing a situation in real time. She got in. "And Kosi called me," she said. "She called me too." He put the vehicle in reverse. 30 seconds after she called you. She's going to JAG. She's already moving. He pulled out of the space. "I've got a contact in the JAG office at Fort Lindell who can have someone ready for her. The issue is what Stratos does in the next hour. They don't know she has the original. They suspect. Suspicion is enough. If their legal team moves to have her access to base facilities suspended on contract grounds, can they do that in 90 minutes? Maybe not. But they can create enough procedural friction to slow her down until 6 o'clock. He accelerated up the ramp toward the structure exit. The meeting at 6 isn't random. That's a deadline. If they get her in a room with their liaison before she's had independent legal counsel, anything she says becomes part of their record, not hers. Mara pressed her back against the seat and thought, who initiated the 6 o'clock meeting? Her supervisor or Stratos' liaison directly. Warwick glanced at her. The liaison contacted the supervisor, and the supervisor passed the request along as a recommendation. She worked through the chain. Does the supervisor know what Nkosi has? I don't know. If the supervisor doesn't know, the recommendation to attend feels routine, administrative. Nkosi might not have pushed back hard enough on it without knowing she was being managed into a corner. She thought about the phone call, the low, controlled voice, the thin edge underneath it. Nkosi had known. She'd been watching the corner approach for 5 weeks. She knows she got out. I know she got out. The question is whether Stratos' legal team contacts JAG directly and tries to characterize her as a security risk before she gets there. On what grounds? Unauthorized retention of proprietary quality documentation. Mara turned and looked at him straight. That documentation shows their product caused the deaths of 2 military working dogs and the injury of a Navy SEAL commander. If they try to suppress it by going after the whistleblower, they're not managing a legal problem. They're creating a federal one. They may not see it that way yet. Then someone needs to make sure they see it correctly. Warwick was quiet for a moment, navigating out of the parking structure into the pale afternoon. Calvert City moved past the windows in its ordinary way storefronts. An intersection, a woman pushing a stroller, the everyday texture of a Tuesday that had no idea what was happening. "Colonel Marsh," he said. "Get her on the phone." He was already dialing. The call to Marsh lasted 4 minutes and covered territory in 4 minutes that would have taken a committee an afternoon. Marsh asked 3 questions, the same 3 she'd asked that morning, clean, factual, no redundancy. And by the time Warwick ended the call, she'd already said she was contacting the DOD IG's office directly. "That initiates the formal investigation," Warwick said. "Which starts the clock on records preservation," Mara said. "Stratos can't manage their documentation once a federal investigation is open. It also means whatever Nkosi has goes into federal evidence. She won't control what happens to it after that. She hasn't had control for 5 weeks. At least this way it means something." She looked at her phone. Nkosi hadn't sent anything. "How far is Fort Lindell from here?" 22 minutes without traffic. She looked at the time. 4:49. She can make it. Neither of them said anything for a moment. I owe you something, Warwick said. She didn't look at him. You don't. The report I received last night. Before I came to the hospital, he kept his eyes on the road. The version that characterized what happened in the trauma bay, I accepted it without verifying the source. I was prepared to authorize an outcome I shouldn't have been prepared for. You changed your position when the evidence changed. After you made me look at the evidence, she thought about how to respond to that and decided the truth was the only thing that fit. You weren't the only one who needed to look at it. Half that building needed to look at it. She shifted in the seat, trying to find a position that was less unkind to her lower back. The problem isn't individual people making bad calls in the dark. The problem is a system that made the bad call easy and the right call expensive. She looked out the window. That's what Stratos counted on. He drove. She sat. After a moment, she said, when this is over, the investigation, the documentation, all of it, Burke needs to be the first person officially informed about Sable. Not through channels, directly. Someone who can sit with him for that conversation. Warwick's hands adjusted on the wheel. I'll take care of it personally. She nodded. They drove. Fort Lindell's Eastgate admitted them at 5:12, which left 48 minutes before the 6 o'clock meeting. And Mara had never been on this particular base before, but she'd been on bases, and the geography of them was similar enough, the grid logic, the administrative buildings in specific relationship to each other, the way the air had a different quality inside the fence line, contained purposeful, a little pressurized. The JAG office was in a low building with a flagpole out front, and Vera Nkosi was already there. Mara recognized her by the way she was standing, not the face. She'd never seen the face, but the posture of someone who had been running a controlled internal response for weeks and had arrived somewhere and stopped moving and was now dealing with what that felt like. She was in uniform, late 30s, a tightness around her eyes that had nothing to do with the overhead fluorescent and everything to do with 5 weeks of careful, solitary decision-making. She looked at Mara when Mara came through the door, and something in her face shifted, something that might have been relief and also wasn't quite. Because relief required a door to close behind you, and this door was still open. Mara Voss, Mara said. I know. Nkosi looked at her, the scrubs, the obvious hours behind them, the pregnancy. You've been awake since yesterday. Since before yesterday. Mara sat down across from her because her back had moved past aching into a specific insistence she was going to have to deal with eventually. Tell me about the addendum. Nkosi sat. Her JAG representative, a captain named Leo Ferris, young, focused, clearly already briefed, sat to her left and didn't interrupt. I submitted the original behavioral evaluation on Havoc 4 weeks ago, Nkosi said. Her voice was steady. She'd rehearsed this, or she'd been going over it for so long that it had achieved the flatness of rehearsal. The assessment was based on field observation and the behavioral incident reports from the unit. I noted the frequency reactive pattern early. I flagged it in my preliminary notes, not definitively, but as a variable to investigate. She stopped. My field supervisor at Stratos reviewed my draft before I submitted it. The frequency variable was removed from the final submitted version. By your supervisor, he said it was speculative, that it would muddy the behavioral finding. The behavioral finding was that Havoc showed escalating instability consistent with early-stage neurological. She stopped. I didn't believe that finding, but I submitted it, because I was told to. Mara didn't say anything. She let it be what it was. 3 weeks later, I submitted the addendum, and Nkosi continued. By then, I had seen 2 more cases, one other dog on the VX system showing the same frequency reactive pattern, and Sable. Sable's pattern was the clearest. It was textbook once you knew what to look for. She looked at her hands. Sable was euthanized 6 days after I submitted the addendum. The addendum was pulled from the record 2 days after I submitted it. I was told by my supervisor that it violated the terms of my assessment contract because it implicated the equipment rather than the animal, which was the entire point, Mara said. Yes, Nkosi's voice didn't waver. The contract with the military specifies that behavioral assessments are provided for the purpose of K9 unit management. It doesn't specify that those assessments are required to be accurate. That's the gap. She looked up. I found the original quality review when I went looking. It wasn't hard to find. It was in a shared drive folder that technically I wasn't supposed to have access to, but the permissions were misconfigured and nobody had caught it. She paused. I think it had been moved there accidentally. Someone in engineering probably didn't know what they were putting where, or they knew exactly, Mara said. Nkosi considered that. Maybe. The document's been in your possession for 5 weeks. Yes. Why did you wait? The question sat between them plainly. Nkosi didn't flinch from it. Because I was scared, she said. And because I kept thinking there was going to be an internal process that would surface it without me having to. She stopped. Without me having to become the person who surfaced it. She looked at the table. There wasn't going to be an internal process. I knew that for about 3 weeks and I kept not acting on what I knew. Ferris shifted in his seat. He was listening to all of this with the expression of someone assembling a legal structure in real time. The document, he said. Where is it? Nkosi reached into the bag at her feet and produced a sealed envelope. Physical original. I have a digital copy in an encrypted folder that only I can access. She looked at Ferris. I need to know what happens to me. Whistleblower protections under the Military Whistleblower Protection Act apply to your situation, Ferris said. Given that you're a contracted assessor working with federal military units, and given that the information concerns risks to military personnel and assets. What happens to me specifically, Nkosi said. Not in general. Ferris looked at her directly. He was young, but he wasn't soft. It's going to be hard before it gets easier. Stratos will fight the characterization of the document. They'll contest your access to it, your interpretation of it, your motivations. It's going to take time. How much time? Months? Minimum. Possibly longer. Nkosi absorbed this. Then she put the envelope on the table and slid it toward him. Okay, she said. The word sat there small, decisive, exhausted, and Mara felt the weight of what it cost in the specific way she'd felt Havoc lean into her hand at 4 a.m. The particular surrender of something that had been held too tightly for too long. Ferris picked up the envelope. At 6:17, Stratos Defense's legal liaison arrived at the base legal office for a 6 o'clock meeting that was not going to happen the way he had planned it. His name was Marcus Teal, and he was 45, expensively suited, and he came through the door with the bearing of a man who had managed 100 of these situations and expected this one to behave like the other 100. He took in the room Nkosi, Ferris, Warwick, Mara, and a colonel from the JAG staff who had been there for the last 20 minutes, and the bearing adjusted almost imperceptibly into something that was still professional, but had lost its certainty. Commander Warwick, he said, looking at Warwick. I wasn't expecting. I know, Warwick said. Teal looked at Mara. The look was brief but complete scrubs. Pregnancy, the folder on the table in front of her. He had clearly been briefed on who she was, which meant Stratos had been tracking her since at least the noon meeting. She filed that too. Mr. Teal, the JAG colonel said, please be advised that Lieutenant Nkosi is present with legal representation, and that a formal complaint has been filed with the DoD Inspector General's office as of 4:58 this afternoon regarding the Stratos VX-K9 communication system. He looked at the paperwork in front of him. Under federal records preservation requirements, all documentation relating to the VX system's design, testing, and deployment, including internal quality reviews, is subject to a litigation hold as of this moment. Teal's expression did not change. This was the trained version, the expression that didn't change, because it had been trained not to. But something in him had gone very still. On what basis, he said, was the IG complaint filed? Evidence of a known equipment defect in the Stratos VX-K9 proximity communication module that was cleared for deployment, despite internal documentation identifying the defect, the JAG colonel said, resulting in the physical harm of military working animals and the disability of a Navy SEAL officer. Commander Cross's accident has not been causally linked. Not yet, Warwick said. The room held. Teal looked at Nkosi. Something passed between them, not a threat. Nothing that could be characterized as a threat, but the specific communication of two people who understood exactly what was at stake and were now in the same room, making different calculations about it. Lieutenant Nkosi, he said, I'd encourage you to consider the terms of your assessment contract before. Mr. Teal, Ferris said, my client is present with legal representation, and any communication directed to her should be directed through me. He left no space for the next sentence. Her contract has been reviewed. It does not supersede federal whistleblower protections. Teal looked at the envelope on the table. He didn't say anything else. He left at 6:41 and the room exhaled. Mara didn't exhale. She was watching the door long after it closed. He's going to make calls, she said. He's already making them, Warwick said. Calloway. She looked at Warwick. The name on the clearance form. R. Calloway. Do we know who that is yet? Warwick looked at the JAG colonel, who looked at a document on the table. Ryan Calloway, VP of Compliance at Stratos Fence Acoustics. 8 years with the company. He signed the clearance form 6 weeks ago, 48 hours after the engineering flag. What was he told by engineering? We don't know yet. That's going to be part of the investigation. She thought about the 48 hours, the gap between a red flag and a cleared for deployment. A VP of compliance had a specific job, which was to evaluate risk and make a determination. The determination he'd made was within acceptable operational variance. That determination had gone out in writing, with his name on it, and the equipment had shipped. Whether Calloway had known precisely what the variance meant, whether he'd been told straight and signed anyway, or whether he'd been told something else and signed on incomplete information, was the question the investigation would have to answer. But the document existed. The signature existed. The dogs were dead. "There's something else," Nkosi said, from across the table. She'd been quiet since Tila left, sitting with her hands flat on the table, and now she looked up. "The accident on Route 9. Mara went very still. Commander Cross's vehicle accident," Nkosi said. "I don't have hard evidence. I want to be clear about that. But 3 days before the accident, I became aware that Cross had submitted a behavioral report on Havoc that named the VX module as a possible variable." She paused. "I became aware because my field supervisor mentioned it. He mentioned it specifically. He said his exact words were, 'Your assessment is going to be important this week. Make sure it's clean.'" The phrase landed in the room and stayed. "Make sure it's clean." "He told you this 3 days before the accident," Warwick said.
Yes.
"And 2 days after that, Cross was in a vehicle accident on a route he drove regularly." "Yes." Nkosi's voice was steady and her eyes were not steady, and she was managing the gap between them very carefully. "I don't know what it means. I don't know if it means anything. But I've been sitting with it for weeks, and I needed to say it." Mara looked at Warwick. Warwick was not a man whose face gave much away, and right now his face was giving nothing away at all, which was itself a kind of information. "The accident investigation," she said. "Still open," he said. "Route 9 intersection, no responsible party identified. The vehicle that came through the intersection, not yet located." She thought about Darian Cross in the ICU, turning his face toward the window, saying, "I've been replaying it. I don't know." The darkness of Route 9. The specific accident happening 3 days after his supervisor became aware of his report. She thought about Teal in the parking lot right now making calls, and she thought about what he was managing and who he was calling and what he was trying to preserve. "We need the accident investigation transferred to the IG's office," she said. "That's not a small request," Warwick said. "I know. It implies something significant. I know what it implies." He looked at her. He looked at Nkosi. He looked at the JAG colonel, who was very carefully not having an expression about any of this. "I'll make the request," Warwick said. It was past 8 when Mara got back to Harlow Regional. She hadn't planned to go back, or rather she hadn't made a plan, which amounted to the same thing. But she found herself in the lobby, then in the elevator, then in the corridor outside the room on the ground floor that still had Havoc in it. Rains was asleep in the chair by the door, which had become his default state, and she didn't wake him. She opened the door quietly. Havoc raised his head. His right ear twitched, not the anxious tracking rotation of last night. Something slower, more deliberate. He looked at her in the low light. She sat down on the floor. Her back made a specific complaint about this that she filed under later, along with everything else in that category. He moved forward and put his head in her lap, which was becoming a pattern she suspected was going to be difficult to discontinue. "It's moving," she told him. "The investigation is open. Nkosi's document is in federal hands." She put one hand on his side, the way she'd learned to flat firm, just presence. "You're not going anywhere." She didn't know if he understood her. She knew he heard her, which was different. She sat with him for a while in the quiet room, and she thought about Cross and Nkosi and Sable, and a signature on a clearance form at a vehicle intersection on Route 9, and she thought about the particular way that systems failed not all at once, not dramatically, but in the accumulated small decisions of people who looked at a known risk and wrote acceptable and moved on. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. A message from Warwick, IG office is taking the accident investigation. Cross has been informed. She put the phone down. Then it buzzed again. A different number rings from the chair outside the door, which meant he'd woken up, which meant she hadn't been as quiet as she'd thought. "There's someone at the front desk asking for you. Says his name is Calloway." She read it twice, then she read it a third time. She looked down at Havoc, who was still and warm and breathing slow, and she felt the specific quality of what was about to happen, not danger. Exactly, not yet. Something more precise than danger. The moment in which a person who has been managing a situation from a distance decides they need to manage it up close. Ryan Calloway, VP of Compliance, the signature on the form. The 48 hours between the flag and the clearance. He'd come to the hospital. She didn't know if that was because he wanted to talk, or because Teely had sent him, or because he was afraid, or because he had calculated that a pregnant nurse in a hospital corridor at 8 in the evening was a problem he could still contain face to face. She sat for one more moment with her hand on Havoc's side. Then she stood up. She stood up. Her back registered the movement with a particular sharpness that she breathed through and then set aside, the way she'd been setting aside everything that belonged to her body for the past 22 hours. She looked at Havoc, who had watched her rise, with the attentive stillness of an animal that understood departures. "Stay," she said, not a command, more like a promise that she'd come back. She went out into the corridor and closed the door behind her. Rains was awake in the chair, phone still in his hand, and he looked at her with the specific alertness of someone who had processed the message he'd just sent and understood its implications. "You don't have to go down there," he said.
I know.
She straightened her scrubs, a pointless gesture. She was 22 hours into a shift and looked precisely like that, and there was nothing she was going to do about it in the next 30 seconds. "Stay with him." She took the stairs. Ryan Calloway was standing near the front desk with his coat still on, which meant he'd been there less than 2 minutes and hadn't committed to staying. He was 51, according to what the JAG Colonel's documents had shown, and he looked it not old but inhabited, the face of someone who had spent a long time making decisions that required him to think of himself as reasonable. He saw her come through the stairwell door, and she watched the micro-calculation happen behind his eyes, the scrubs, the pregnancy, the hour. And then he arranged his expression into something that was trying to be neutral and was not quite getting there. "Ms. Voss," he said. "Nurse Voss," she said. "Not hostile. Just accurate." He nodded once. "I wanted to speak with you directly." "All right." He looked at the lobby around them, the front desk, the security guard, a family clustered near the far seating area. "Somewhere more private?" "Here is fine," she said. She was not going anywhere more private with this man, and she let that be clear in the way she planted her feet and stayed where she was. He processed that. "I understand an IG complaint was filed today." "That's correct. I want you to know." He stopped. Started again, which told her something about how prepared he'd been for this specific conversation versus how prepared he'd thought he was. "The clearance I signed 6 weeks ago was made in good faith. The engineering report was reviewed. The conclusion that the variance was within operational parameters was based on what the engineering team told you," she said. He looked at her. "Or on what you needed the engineering team's finding to be," she said. "Because those are two different things, Mr. Calloway, and the investigation is going to spend a significant amount of time on exactly that difference." His jaw tightened. "I'm not here to discuss the investigation. I'm here because I think there may be a version of this that what?" She kept her voice even. Not loud, not hard, just level in a way that didn't leave room for the sentence to go anywhere useful for him. "That resolves quietly? That doesn't require your name in a federal proceeding?" She looked at him with the same attention she'd given every variable in this situation for the last 22 hours. "2 military working dogs are dead. A Navy SEAL commander has a chest tube in him on the 3rd floor. Your company's embedded assessment officer has been sitting on documentation of your product's defect for 5 weeks because she was afraid of what would happen to her career if she came forward." She paused. "That's what your good faith clearance produced. There isn't a version of that resolves quietly." Calloway was very still. Whatever he'd come here expecting, contrition, maybe, or negotiability, or the manageable anxiety of someone who could still be managed, she wasn't giving him any of it. "The investigation will determine." He started. "The investigation will determine what you knew and when," she said. "The document already establishes the flag existed. The timeline already establishes you had 48 hours with it. What the investigation adds is the emails, the meetings, the phone calls that happened in those 48 hours." She watched his face. "I'd recommend you retain independent legal counsel before tomorrow morning. Not Stratos' legal team, your own." He looked at her for a long moment. There was something in his face then, not the composure, that was still mostly in place, but underneath it, something she recognized because she'd seen it before, in people who had arrived at the moment when the distance between what they'd done and what they'd told themselves about it became impossible to maintain. He didn't say anything else. He turned and walked back out through the main doors. She watched him go. The security guard at the front desk was looking at her. She looked back at him and he looked away. She went back to the stairs. She did not go home that night. She meant to. She sat in the break room at 9:45 with her bag in her lap and her keys in her hand, and found that she couldn't make the sequence of decisions that would get her out the door Not because she was too tired, but because the adrenaline of the last several hours had not finished metabolizing, and her body was still running on it. And if she went home right now, she would lie in her dark apartment and stare at the ceiling, and that was worse than the break room. Claudette found her there at 10:15, which was 45 minutes past the end of Claudette's own shift. She sat down across from Mara without being invited, which was becoming a pattern between them. Calloway was in the lobby, Claudette said. I spoke with him. Administration is aware. She folded her hands on the table. There have been calls from Stratos' legal office to the hospital's general counsel, twice in the last 3 hours. I know. The hospital is in a position where the hospital's liability position improved significantly this afternoon, Mara said. The IG investigation is open. The documentation establishing the defect is in federal custody. The causal chain between Stratos' clearance decision and everything that happened in this building last night is going to be established in a federal proceeding, not a civil one. She looked at Claudette. Harlow Regional de-escalated a dangerous situation caused by someone else's defective equipment. That's the story if administration decides to let it be. Claudette was quiet for a moment. You've been here for 22 hours, she said. I know. Mara. Claudette said her name with something in it that hadn't been there this morning, or maybe had been there all along but under too much other material to be audible. Go home. I need to check on. Rains is with the dog. Porter and Gale are covering Cross. The IG investigation is open. She held Mara's eyes. There is nothing in this building tonight that requires you specifically. Go home. Mara sat with that. The honest answer was that she didn't want to go. Not because the work wasn't done. It wasn't done. It wouldn't be done for months. But because going home meant stepping back from the shape of this thing she'd been inside for 22 hours. And she wasn't sure yet what she was without it. That was a very human problem, and she recognized it as one. She stood up. I'll be back tomorrow, I assumed, Claudette said. She slept for 9 hours, which was more than she'd expected and less than she needed, and woke up to 4 missed calls and a text from Warwick that said, update, when you're available. Developments overnight. She called him back from her kitchen while the coffee brewed, standing at the window, looking at the ordinary gray morning of Calvert City, which was also having a Wednesday that had no idea. Calloway retained personal counsel at 11 last night, Warwick said, separate from Stratos. His first call to that counsel was at 9:48, which is about 40 minutes after he left the hospital. You're tracking his calls? The IG office is. Once the investigation opened, they moved fast. He paused. There's more. The accident investigation Route 9. The vehicle that came through the intersection has been identified from traffic camera footage 2 blocks away. It's registered to a shell company. The shell company has connections to a logistics firm that holds a contract with Stratos Defense. She put down her coffee cup. That's not coincidence, she said. No, it is not. His voice was very controlled. EG is treating it as a potential felony. Intentional endangerment of a federal officer. She stood at her window for a long moment. Cross, she said, has been informed. I sat with him last night. A pause. It was a hard conversation. She thought about Cross turning his face to the window. I've been replaying it. The specific weight of learning that you were right to replay it, that what you'd been trying to decide was accident or intention had an answer, and the answer was the one that cost more. How is he? Angry, which is appropriate. Warwick's voice was brief on that. He's also asking about Havoc. Tell him Havoc is good. Tell him Holst is coming back this afternoon to recheck the ear. I'll tell him. She picked up her coffee. What happens now? The IG investigation runs its course. Stratos Defense is going to have a very difficult few months. Calloway and potentially others are looking at federal charges depending on what the document chain shows about who knew what. He paused again. The K9 cases. Every dog that was flagged as unstable while on the VX system is being reviewed. There are 7 total, across 3 units. 5 are still alive and in foster situations while their status was pending. 2 I know, she said. The 2 that weren't alive had names. Sable and Kira. She'd learned Kira's name from Nkosi the night before, briefly in passing, and it had joined Zibbles in the specific place she was keeping them. The 5 living dogs are being cleared, he said. Their behavioral records are being corrected. The euthanasia orders are formally rescinded as of this morning. She exhaled slowly. Burke, she said, I spoke with him last night, after Cross. A longer pause this time. He didn't say much. He just needed to know the truth. She understood that. Sometimes the truth didn't fix anything, and it was still the only thing that mattered. I need to get to the hospital, she said. One more thing, Warwick said. Colonel Marsh has formally requested that your observational record and documentation be entered into the IG investigation as foundational evidence. She's also, he stopped for a moment, which was not something Warwick did, and the pause had a quality to it. She's submitting a commendation to hospital administration. For you, she wants it on record that the identification of the acoustic trauma pattern, the frequency correlation, and the connection to the equipment defect, none of the investigation exists without that. Mara was quiet. Mara, he said, I heard you. I know you heard me. I'm not sure you're letting it land. She looked out the window at the gray morning. I'm letting it land, she said. I just need a minute. She took the minute. The coffee was still warm. Outside, a car passed, and a man walked a dog ordinary, unhurried, unconnected to any of this, and the city continued its Wednesday without her. Thank you, she said finally, to Warwick for the call, for sitting with Cross. For the 48 hours of this, he'd spent standing on the right side of things, even when his first instinct had been toward the wrong one. She thought that mattered. She thought the capacity to change position when the evidence changed was one of the things that separated people who did damage from people who didn't. And she thought Warwick was someone who had that capacity and had used it. And that was worth acknowledging. I'll see you at the hospital, she said. She ended the call and drank her coffee, and then she went. The next 3 weeks moved in the particular rhythm of an institutional unraveling, not dramatic from the outside, mostly documents and depositions and formal notifications, but underneath that surface, the tectonic kind of movement that preceded everything changing shape. The Deputy Inspector General's investigation produced its preliminary findings in 16 days, which was fast, which meant either the evidence was unusually clean or the investigators had been unusually motivated, and Mara suspected it was both. The findings established that Stratos Defense Acoustics had shipped the VXK9 proximity communication module with a documented acoustic frequency defect, that the defect had been identified by their own engineering division prior to shipping, and that the quality clearance signed by Ryan Calloway had been issued based on a risk assessment that the investigation characterized as materially incomplete and potentially influenced by contract performance pressure. Calloway's own legal counsel, it emerged, was actively cooperating with investigators. The emails from the 48-hour window told a story that was both specific and depressingly familiar: a VP of compliance receiving an engineering flag, forwarding it to the division president, receiving back a single-line response that read, "We can't hold this batch," sorted out, and writing the clearance notation himself 4 hours later. The division president's name was Gerald Fitch, and Gerald Fitch had been with Stratos for 23 years and had made VP of Operations the previous January, and Gerald Fitch was the second name added to the federal complaint 2 weeks into the investigation. Calloway got ahead of it. That was how his attorney characterized it. He provided a full account of the 48-hour period, the communications, the pressure from above, and his own decision, which he described in his deposition as the worst of his professional life, which Mara heard about secondhand and filed without much feeling. She didn't particularly need him to feel bad about it. She needed the record to be accurate, and the record was going to be accurate. Fitch did not cooperate. Fitch retained Stratos' full legal apparatus and contested every finding and issued a statement through counsel characterizing the investigation as an overreach driven by incomplete understanding of standard compliance procedures in the defense contracting sector. The statement was 2 pages long and contained the phrase operational variance 4 times, which turned out to be a significant miscalculation because the phrase now had specific federal documentation attached to it, and using it publicly just underscored what it meant. Marcus Teal, the legal liaison, withdrew from the Stratos account 11 days into the investigation without public comment. Mara had no information about what that decision cost him professionally, and didn't particularly seek any. The VX module was formally recalled. All units across all active deployments were pulled for inspection within 72 hours of the preliminary findings, which meant the investigation had moved fast enough that the recall came before Stratos could contest it in court. 61 K9 units were affected. 37 showed some degree of module degradation. 14 showed the specific corrosion pattern associated with continuous unintended transmission. Of those 14, 9 dogs had behavioral incident reports in their records from the period of deployment. All 9 records were corrected. Darian Cross was discharged from Harlow Regional on a Thursday afternoon, 21 days after the accident on Route 9. He came out of the elevator with a cane he was clearly not yet comfortable with and a chest that was going to need another 6 weeks before it would let him forget about it. and he was met in the lobby by Warwick and Rains and two other people from his unit who had apparently been waiting in the parking lot for the last hour because nobody had told them what time he was being discharged, and they'd decided to cover a range. Mara was at the nurse's station when he came past. He stopped. "I know you were reassigned for my care," he said. "Hospital policy," she said. "You had good nurses." "I had adequate nurses." He said it without malice, just accuracy. "You were the one who should have been there." She looked at him, the cane, the careful way he was holding his torso, the eyes that were sharp in a face that still showed what the last 3 weeks had taken. "How's the pain?" "Manageable." A pause. "Havoc's at the base right now. Dr. Holst cleared him last week." "I know. She sent me the follow-up report." "You're good. Inflammation resolved, no permanent damage." She held his eyes. "He's going to be fine." Cross nodded slowly. There was something he was working out how to say, and she waited for him to work it out. "I spent a lot of time in that ICU," he said, "thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't been in that room." "Don't," she said. "I'm not being, I know. But don't spend time on what didn't happen. Spend it on what did." She picked up the chart she'd been working on. "Go home, Commander. Let your chest heal." He almost smiled. It had the same quality as Warwick's almost smile, the military compression of things that wanted to be larger. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He went. Bernard Hollis submitted a formal correction to his incident report on a Tuesday 25 days after the night in question. Mara wasn't there when he did it. She heard about it from Claudette, who stopped by the station with the specific manner of someone who has been carrying a piece of information and has decided the right time to deliver it is now. He amended the record, Claudette said. "The resolution of the Trauma Bay incident is now attributed to nursing staff intervention prior to any animal control involvement." She paused. He didn't apologize, but he signed the correction. "That's enough," Mara said. Claudette looked at her for a moment with that nameless expression she'd been wearing for 3 weeks, ever since the morning after, ever since the break room conversation. "Is it?" Mara thought about it honestly. An apology from Bernard Hollis would have been for his benefit, not mine. The record being correct is for everyone else's. She shrugged, which was a limited gesture at 31 weeks along. "That's enough." Claudette sat down across from her, which was also becoming a pattern, and for a moment she didn't say anything, which was unusual enough that Mara looked up. "I should have asked about the rehabilitation work," Claudette said, "before any of this." Mara held her eyes. "I managed you sideways because you were pregnant and I thought I was protecting the unit," Claudette said. "And maybe some of it was protecting the unit, but some of it was." She stopped. "I decided what you could handle, without asking you." The honesty of it sat between them without decoration. "Yes," Mara said. "You did, I'm sorry." It was not a complicated apology. It was not a long one. It had the quality of something that had been considered carefully before being said, which made it more valuable than something larger and less considered would have been. "I know," Mara said. "Thank you." They sat for a moment in the unremarkable fluorescent light of the nurse's station. Two women who had spent 6 years in the same building, not quite seeing each other clearly. And then Claudette stood up and went back to work, and Mara went back to her chart, and that was how that went. Not a resolution that transformed everything. Just a correction. Just the record being accurate. Which was, she was finding, often what things looked like when they actually got better. The formal commendation from Colonel Marsh arrived at Harlow Regional's administration office on a Friday. Mara found out about it the way she found out about most things indirectly. After the fact, when it had already been processed and filed. Claudette sent her an email with the subject line, FYI, see attached. The commendation was 2 paragraphs, formal language, the kind of document that existed in a specific institutional register that could seem bloodless if you read it wrong. But the substance of it was clear. The identification of acoustic trauma as the behavioral driver, the frequency correlation observation, the documentation that preceded and enabled the investigation, the de-escalation that made the difference between a military working dog being euthanized and a federal equipment fraud case being opened. The second paragraph recommended that Mara Voss's observational record be considered for citation in the final IG investigation report as foundational evidence. She read it twice. Not because she needed to read it twice, but because she was giving herself permission to let it be real. She had spent the better part of a year being managed into corners, by scheduling, by assignment, by the particular institutional geometry that moved pregnant women away from the work they were trained to do, without ever quite saying, that's what it was doing. She had spent the previous 4 weeks watching a system fail in the specific way that systems failed when the people lungs inside them stopped asking what was actually true and started asking what was convenient. She had spent 22 hours in a hospital trying to get people to look at a dog the way she was looking at a dog, which was as though the animal's experience mattered, and its behavior meant something, and the truth of what was happening was worth pursuing, even when the pursuit was inconvenient. She'd been right. Not because being right was easy or guaranteed, or something she'd been certain of in the dark of that break room at 2 in the morning. She'd been right because she'd paid attention, because she'd refused to accept the expedient interpretation, because she'd stayed in the room when every institutional signal told her she was supposed to leave. That was the thing nobody gave you a commendation for, exactly. The staying. The refusal to let your own certainty be dissolved by other people's convenience. The choice, made again and again across 22 hours, to keep looking at what was actually there. She filed the email. She went back to work. She saw Havoc one more time before the formal ceremony, which happened 6 weeks after the night, in question on a Tuesday morning when Calvert City was doing the crisp early November thing it did when the weather finally committed. Warwick brought him to the hospital not officially. The hospital hadn't authorized any of it. But Warwick had a specific relationship with institutional authorization that involved doing what he judged necessary and being right often enough that nobody argued with the outcomes. He came through the main entrance with Havoc on a lead and a look on his face that dared anyone at the front desk to make it into a thing. Nobody made it into a thing. She met them in the lobby. Havoc saw her before she got to them, the pale yellow eyes tracking across the space, finding her, the ears rotating forward with a precision that was nothing like the anxious tracking of 6 weeks ago. Clean, present himself. He came to her immediately, and she crouched down with some effort and put both hands on his face, and he leaned into it with the complete confidence of an animal that had been in pain for 6 and was no longer in pain, and the difference was physical and unmistakable. "Hey," she said. "Hi. There you are." He put his nose against her cheek. She stayed down there longer than her back wanted her to, both hands on his head, and she thought about the storage room and the 4 in the morning, and the way he'd looked at her when she'd said, "I see you in that particular moment of chaos." And she thought about what it meant to be seen when everything around you was insisting on the wrong story about you. "He remembers you," Warwick said. "I know." She straightened up, one hand still on Havoc's head. "How is he on signals now?" "New equipment, different manufacturer, different frequency range, tested extensively before any canine unit touched it." He paused. He responded to Cross's first signal test last week, like he'd never had a problem. "The handler-dog communication is clean," she nodded. "The ceremony next week," Warwick said. "You're expected to attend. I was told it was optional." "It's not optional," he said. Simply not as an order, just as a fact that he was reporting. She looked at him. "All right." Havoc sat down beside her foot, which was also a pattern at this point, and the three of them stood in the lobby of Harlow Regional Medical Center in the particular Tuesday morning light that came through the main entrance and asked nothing of anyone. The ceremony was in the hospital's main conference space, which had been cleared and rearranged to hold approximately 90 people, which was more than Mara had expected, and also somehow exactly the right number. Cross was there in dress uniform with the cane he was using less each week. Rains was there. And Cosi was there, which mattered more than most things. She'd come in from Fort Lindell in her own uniform, and she sat near the back and didn't make a speech, and her presence was its own kind of statement about the cost of doing the right thing and the necessity of doing it anyway. Burke was there. She hadn't met him before, and she looked at him across the room, a compact man in his 40s, with a face that showed what the last several weeks had been. And she thought that some losses didn't have a repair, and the only thing you could offer someone carrying one was the truth about how it happened, and the assurance that someone had seen it clearly. She hoped that was enough. She suspected it had to be, because it was what there was. Colonel Marsh spoke briefly and specifically, which was how Marsh did everything, and what she said was about the investigation and its findings and the formal commendation and the correction of the canine behavioral records, and she said it in the language of military citation, which was formal but not cold, and she said Mara's name twice in a way that made it clear the citation was not a procedural formality. Hospital administration was represented by the chief medical officer, Dr. Priya Osei, who had come into this situation late and from the outside, but had understood it quickly, and she spoke about the hospital's commitment to accurate documentation and clinical observation, which were real values and also values that had not, until recently, been applied to this particular situation. And Mara appreciated that Osei didn't pretend otherwise. Claudette was in the third row. She didn't speak. She sat with her hands in her lap, and when Mara looked at her, she gave a single nod, which was the right amount. Mara spoke last. She had written something the night before, and then not read it, because the written version was too careful, and what she wanted to say required less care and more accuracy. She stood at the front of the room and looked at the 90 people and at Cross with his cane and Nkosi in the back, and Rains, who had apparently made attendance his new default setting, and she said what was true. I was restocking a crash cart when this started, she said. That was my assignment. Not because it was where my skills were best used, but because someone had decided I needed a simpler task. She didn't look at Claudette when she said that. There was no point in looking at any one person. This was true about all the decisions, all the moments of managed removal, not about any individual. I've been doing that math all year, what I'm capable of versus what I'm allowed to reach for. And I want to say something about that. Because I think most people in this room know that math, you've done it too. You've sat with a version of yourself that other people have decided is the limited version, and you've had to choose between staying inside that version because it's easier or pushing past it because the situation requires it. She paused. What I saw in that trauma bay was not a dangerous dog. It was an animal in pain that everyone had already decided was a threat, because the threat narrative was easier than the pain narrative. The pain narrative required asking different questions and looking for different answers and possibly being wrong along the way. She thought about Havoc's right ear, the tilt of it, the small evidence of something that had been there all along for anyone paying attention. I wasn't special for seeing it. I was just still looking. The room was very quiet. There are 2 dogs that didn't survive long enough for us to look closely enough, she said. That's not a footnote. That's the cost of the expedient interpretation made concrete. Sable and Kira. Their handlers know their names. I think we should all know their names. She let that sit for a moment. The investigation is going to run its course. The people who made the decisions that led to this are going to face consequences in federal proceedings that are not mine to describe or predict. What I can say is that the only thing that prevented more of the same outcome was several people, actually, in different rooms at different times, choosing to look at what was actually there instead of what was easier to see. She looked at Nkosi in the back row. Lieutenant Nkosi held a document for 5 weeks because she didn't know if anyone would listen, she said. She came forward anyway. I want that acknowledged, specifically and by name, because that took more than I had to do, and she did it. Nkosi looked at her hands. A single breath, visible from across the room, and then she looked up, and what was on her face was complicated and real, and not a performance for anyone. Mara looked back at the room. I'm 32 weeks pregnant, she said. People have been telling me all year what that means about what I can handle. I'll let the last 6 weeks speak to that. She didn't say it sharply. She said it the way you said something that was simply true. The baby doesn't make me less of a nurse. The pregnancy didn't impair my judgment. What it did was make certain people comfortable making decisions about my capacity without asking me. She paused. Don't do that to the people around you. You don't know what they're carrying. You don't know what they've learned in the parts of their life they haven't shared with you. Ask. Or at minimum, don't assume you already know. She looked at the room for a moment longer. Havoc is fine, she said. That's what I want you to take from this. The outcome we were all trying to prevent didn't happen. The dogs that are alive with accurate records and clean behavioral histories. The people who made choices that cost lives are in the process of being held accountable for those choices. She let herself have the plainness of it. It went right. Not because it was easy or inevitable, but because enough people chose, at each decision point, to do the harder thing. She stepped back from the front of the room. That's all I have. The applause when it came was not the performative kind. It was the kind that built because people were letting it, and it was enough. Afterward, in the corridor outside, Cross found her. He looked better than he had in the lobby 3 weeks ago, less gray around the edges. The cane present, but used differently, more like a precaution than a necessity. 6 more weeks on the cane, he said, which was not what she'd expected him to say first. Could be worse, she said, yeah. He looked at the floor for a moment, then back at her. I've been trying to figure out what to say to you for about 3 weeks. You don't have to say anything, I know. I want to. He was quiet for a moment. I've been in the field for 12 years. I've been trained to read environments, read threats, read my dog, and I missed this. Right in front of me for 6 weeks, I missed it. You were managing everything else, she said. You can't see everything. You saw it in 30 seconds. I was standing still, she said. I wasn't managing anything else in that moment. I was just looking. He thought about that. That's almost worse. Or it means the capacity was always there, she said. You just needed someone to be still long enough to use it. She looked at him. How's the chest? Better. Better every week. Good. She picked up her bag. Take care of him, I will. Cross held her eyes. Nurse Voss. For what it's worth, in 12 years, I've met a lot of people who were underestimated and knew it and got smaller because of it. He paused. You didn't get smaller. She thought about all the ways she'd been invited to get smaller. The scheduling shifts, the chart reassignments, the break room conversation that was supposed to make her feel managed into reasonableness. The specific cumulative pressure of an institution telling a woman in a particular physical condition that smaller was appropriate, smaller was safe, smaller was what the moment called for. She hadn't gotten smaller. Not because she was certain she was right. She hadn't been certain. Not at 2 a.m. in a room, with a traumatized dog, and a building full of people who'd already decided the story. Not because it wasn't frightening, it was frightening. In the particular way that being the only person looking at a thing correctly was frightening, which was the fear of being wrong alone. She'd stayed present because the alternative was the dog dying, for reasons nobody looked for. Because the truth was available if you were still enough to find it. Because 22 years of carrying her own knowledge quietly had not in the end made her doubt the knowledge itself. Thank you, she said to Cross. She went back through the doors and into the hospital, which was a place she had been treating people for 6 years, and would continue treating people for however many years followed this one, and which looked exactly the same as it always had, and which was also different now in ways that weren't visible but were real. 3 weeks later, on a morning in early December, when the first real cold had come to Calvert City, Mara sat in the break room on the first floor at 6:47 in the morning, before her shift, with a cup of coffee she was actually going to finish. And she felt the baby kick, not the rolling, indifferent movement of earlier weeks. A real kick, specific, deliberate, directed at her left side with an energy that suggested opinions. She put her hand there. I know, she said, I know. We're almost there. The kick came again. You're going to be very loud, she said. Aren't you? She sat with her hand on her side in the quiet of the break room, in the particular early morning illness before a shift, when the hospital was running, but hadn't yet reached the full velocity of the day, and she thought about what she was going to tell this child, about the year it came into the world, not the version that made it into commendations, not the version with the clean edges, the real one, with the 22 hours and the aching back, and the break room where she'd almost gone home, and the moment in the trauma bay when she'd been genuinely afraid she was wrong. She'd tell this child that being still enough to see clearly was a skill and it needed practice, and the practice was paying attention in rooms where everyone had already decided not to. She'd tell them that the thing people called intuition was usually just accumulated observation that hadn't been given credit. She'd tell them that the small, steady things, the ear tilt, the frequency correlation, the detail that didn't fit, were worth following, worth the time and the argument and the standing in corridors at midnight waiting for people to catch up. She'd tell them that she'd been afraid and done it anyway, which was not the same as being brave in the way stories made bravery look, but was maybe more honest and more useful. She'd tell them about Havoc, about the way he'd looked at her across a chaos-filled room as if she were the only still point in it, about the 4 a.m. on the storage room floor, his head in her lap, 2 creatures that both knew what it felt like to have the world make up its mind about you before you'd finished speaking. She'd tell them that being dismissed never made the thing you knew less true. It just made the moment of its becoming visible more powerful. The coffee was warm. The hospital was waking up around her, quiet to slightly less quiet, the sound of a new shift finding its rhythm. Somewhere above her, people were healing and struggling, and asking questions and starting over, and in 20 minutes she was going to go up there and be exactly who she was, and do exactly what she was trained to do, without apology and without reduction, for as many hours as the day required. She finished the coffee. She stood up. She went to work.